The pen barely moved across the page, yet the consequences reached into every corridor of the monarchy. King Charles had made decisions under pressure before, but this was different. With one signature, he ordered Camilla's queen title removed from every official palace record, ceremonial reference, internal register, and future royal document. The woman who had stood beside him at the highest point of his reign was suddenly facing an institutional erasure no one inside the palace believed they would ever witness. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat through the silence after days of closed consultations, reading the first page again before his hand moved toward the decree. A decree is a formal order issued under royal authority, and this one was specific. Every future palace record was to remove the title Queen Camilla and use only the status allowed under the new instruction. The monarch signed, placed the pen down, and stared at the page as though the ink had changed more than paperwork. The decision cut deeper, because palace records are not ordinary files. Court circulars, which are official records of royal engagements, sit beside ceremonial registers, correspondence, household documents, archive entries, and precedence lists that determine how senior figures are identified. Once those records change, the institution begins speaking differently. Charles understood that. He was not simply correcting wording. He was changing how the woman beside him would exist inside the official memory of his reign. Camilla received the notice privately and did not answer at first. She read the instruction again, searching for some limit that might soften what she was seeing. Her voice broke the silence with one question. Did this apply only to documents created from that day forward? The aide hesitated before explaining that it went further. Active palace records were also to be reviewed, and references carrying the queen title could be replaced wherever protocol permitted. That second instruction changed everything. The queen consort had expected a restriction, perhaps a ceremonial rebuke, but not a rewriting of the palace language around her. She lowered the paper and asked who had supported the order. No answer came. Elsewhere, the king remained alone with the signed decree, knowing the decision had not formed in isolation. William had raised concerns. Anne had challenged a boundary. And one explosive ceremonial dispute had forced the monarch to confront a question he could no longer avoid. And to understand why Charles was prepared to erase a title he once defended so fiercely, the palace had to confront the people whose loyalties had finally collided. Behind the decree were not faceless committees or dusty constitutional rules. There was a husband forced to choose between the woman he loved and the institution he had inherited. There was an heir watching the monarchy he would one day command. And there was a queen who had spent years believing the hardest battle for acceptance was already behind her. Suddenly, every private relationship inside the family carried the weight of the crown. Charles felt that weight more deeply than anyone. For years he had defended Camilla's place beside him through criticism, resistance, and memories that refused to disappear. Her eventual elevation had felt like the closing of a painful chapter, proof that the monarchy had finally accepted the life he had chosen. But now the same crown he had used to protect her was demanding a boundary. The king understood that royal titles were more than forms of address. They were symbols that told the public where authority sat and how the institution expected that authority to be understood. William carried a different burden. He had no interest in turning the crisis into a personal attack. Yet as heir, he knew every decision made now would eventually shape the monarchy he inherited. The prince viewed titles as constitutional signals, not private rewards. If one title began creating confusion over who could issue instructions, influence ceremonial order, or speak with institutional force, then silence could become more dangerous than confrontation. William chose his words carefully when he finally sat alone with his father. He told Charles that protecting one person could not come at the cost of weakening the authority surrounding the crown. The king did not interrupt. He simply listened, his expression tightening as his son continued. The future monarch made clear that he was not questioning the marriage. He was questioning whether affection had allowed a line of authority to become blurred. Camilla, meanwhile, felt the walls closing around her. She sat with the official notice still in her hands, returning again and again to the sentence defining how palace records would identify her from that moment forward. The queen consort had spent years believing acceptance was secure. Now a few lines of formal language had made that security feel temporary. Anne entered the crisis with far less hesitation. She loved her brother, but quiet loyalty had never meant avoiding difficult truths. In a documented private account later shared with William, the princess revealed that concerns about Camilla's ceremonial influence had circulated inside the household for months. Charles had repeatedly stopped those concerns from becoming a formal dispute, hoping restraint would protect both his marriage and the dignity of the monarchy. That restraint had finally failed. Anne told the prince that the real fracture began during one specific state ceremony, when Camilla issued an instruction that went beyond simple preference and entered territory she believed belonged only to the sovereign. That ceremony would later be remembered inside the palace as the moment a private disagreement became an institutional threat. Every royal crisis has a moment that looks ordinary until history turns back and gives it meaning. For this one, the breaking point came during preparations for a major state ceremony. A seating instruction was changed. A senior royal was displaced. A line of ceremonial authority was quietly rewritten. What appeared to be a minor adjustment became the moment Anne stopped treating the tension as personal and began treating it as a threat to the order of the crown. Anne noticed the change before anyone tried to explain it away. The state ceremony was governed by strict precedents. The formal order that decides where senior royals stand, enter, sit, and carry out official duties. Those details mattered because they were not decorative. They showed the public who represented the sovereign, who followed whom, and where authority rested. One altered position could therefore carry a message far larger than a chair or a place in line. Camilla had grown more confident in the influence surrounding her role. Standing beside Charles through major engagements had given her a wider hand in ceremonial planning, and she had begun treating certain arrangements as decisions she could shape directly. During the final planning meeting, the queen consort ordered Anne's place in the principal receiving line moved behind representatives she had selected herself. She then instructed staff to record the revised arrangement as coming from her office. Anne did not explode. That made the moment more dangerous. She asked one question: had Charles approved the change? When the answer came back that he had not personally authorized it, her anger turned cold. The princess requested a private conversation and confronted Camilla without raised voices, asking why an instruction carrying the weight of royal precedence had been issued without the king. Camilla refused to withdraw it immediately. She argued that her position beside the monarch gave her enough standing to shape the ceremony and prevent confusion. Anne answered with brutal clarity. Marriage to the sovereign did not create a second source of crown authority. The words landed heavily, because neither woman was arguing about preference anymore. They were arguing about power. William understood that the moment he received a copy of the altered instruction. The prince read the wording twice and saw what troubled Anne. The document treated Camilla's office almost as though it could issue authority separately rather than act through Charles. That distinction mattered because the future king knew blurred lines today could become dangerous precedents tomorrow. Anne made her decision without hesitation. She carried the disputed paper directly to her brother and placed it before him. Charles read it once, then again. His face changed. For the first time, he was no longer asking whether two women had clashed. He was asking whether his own household had allowed a boundary around the crown to move. The paper placed the problem in Charles's hands, but the confrontation that followed would force him to choose which relationship he was prepared to wound. There were no cameras, no courtiers standing between them, and no public smiles to hide behind. Charles and Camilla faced each other as husband and wife, but also as sovereign and consort. The disputed ceremony lay between them like evidence. For years, he had defended her against criticism from outside the palace. Now the accusation was coming from inside his own family, and Charles needed an answer that affection alone could no longer provide. Charles placed the altered ceremonial instruction on the table and kept his hand beside it for a moment. He asked why an order with institutional consequences had been issued without his approval. Camilla answered that she had acted to prevent confusion and believed the authority attached to her role allowed her to make practical decisions on his behalf. A consort is the spouse of a reigning monarch, carrying rank, visibility, and influence, but not the sovereign power of the crown itself. That distinction now sat at the center of everything between them. Camilla tried to explain that she had never intended to challenge him. She believed the ceremony needed a clear decision, and she had made one, because hesitation inside the household could create embarrassment in public. The queen consort expected resistance, but not the coldness in his reply. Charles told her that representing him was not the same as exercising authority independently. The words cut deeper than anger because they sounded like something worse, a withdrawal of trust. Charles turned away before saying what he had resisted for months. No private bond, no marriage, and no history between them could be allowed to create uncertainty over where royal authority began and ended. The king understood why the line mattered. If an instruction issued from one office could carry the same weight as his own, without clear permission, then the palace would eventually face competing centers of power. Camilla understood the meaning too, and for the first time her confidence began to collapse. Camilla looked back at the paper and asked how far this had already gone. That question changed the room. The monarch admitted that palace advisors had been instructed to examine official references defining her institutional status, including ceremonial language and household records. The review was no longer about one disputed ceremony. It was about whether the system itself had allowed her role to expand beyond what Charles believed the crown could safely permit. Camilla stood in silence before asking the question that had been building inside her from the moment Anne challenged the change. Had William and Anne pushed him into this? Charles did not answer. He did not defend them, and he did not deny it. The silence was enough. But the true danger was no longer the argument between husband and wife. It was the legal and ceremonial machinery now moving behind closed doors. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. Sometimes it appears as a corrected line in a register, a changed form of address, or a document quietly removed from circulation. As Charles's advisors examined Camilla's position, the question became brutally simple. How much authority had belonged to her by right, and how much had existed only because the king had allowed it? The answer would determine whether the decree could become more than a symbolic rebuke. Charles waited for the review without trying to soften its purpose. The advisors separated the prestige attached to Camilla's title from the sovereign authority held by the monarch himself, concluding that much of her practical influence depended on delegation rather than independent power. Delegation meant authority temporarily exercised because the sovereign allowed it, not because the person possessed the crown's power in their own right. That distinction mattered because it defined whether the disputed ceremony had been a misunderstanding or something more serious. The review went deeper than either side expected. Court circular language, household correspondence, ceremonial precedents, patronage references, archive classifications, and internal administrative forms were examined line by line. Those records mattered because they shaped how the palace described rank and authority every day. If different departments treated Camilla's office differently, confusion could survive long after the original dispute was forgotten. William received the confidential summary and stayed silent for several moments. The prince understood what the conclusions meant, but he refused to treat them as a victory. He told an advisor that any reform had to protect the monarchy without turning into humiliation or revenge. The future king was thinking about Charles as much as the institution. A clean boundary might strengthen the crown, yet it could also leave his father facing a marriage permanently changed by the decision. Anne saw the danger from another angle. She insisted that once Charles acted, the decision had to be clear enough that no department could preserve an older interpretation through habit. The princess warned that contradictory records would only invite another conflict later, perhaps under even greater public pressure. She was not asking for cruelty, she was asking for consistency. Charles finally received the conclusion he had been dreading. The review determined that he controlled enough of the household language, ceremonial documentation, and active palace usage to order a sweeping administrative rewrite. He would not need to create a rival authority or complicated new structure. He could simply instruct the institution to stop using the title. That simplicity made the decision more brutal. Once signed, revised papers began moving through palace offices almost immediately. Camilla would soon discover that royal identity depended not only on ceremony or affection, but on repetition. And when the institution stopped repeating a title, its absence became impossible to ignore. By the following morning, the decree was no longer a private threat. It was visible in black ink across the machinery of the palace. The first proof arrived without ceremony. No announcement echoed through the halls. No official stood before Camilla to declare what had changed. Instead, a newly revised palace document appeared, carrying her name without the title that had defined her place beside Charles. One missing word did what months of arguments had failed to do. It made the new reality undeniable. The decree was no longer something she could challenge in theory. It had begun rewriting her life. Camilla opened the briefing paper and stopped halfway down the first page. The word "Queen" was gone. She read the line again, then slowly placed the document face down on the table. A briefing paper is an internal palace document used to prepare senior royals for duties, meetings, and official appearances. This one mattered because it showed the decree had already moved beyond debate and into the everyday machinery that defined her position. The instructions were spreading quickly. Palace departments had begun updating active templates, internal references, ceremonial lists, and future correspondence, so every new document followed Charles's order. The Queen Consort had expected certain duties to be restricted, perhaps even some ceremonial influence to be taken away, but she had not expected her status to be systematically removed from the language surrounding her. She told a trusted aide that the change felt less like a correction and more like being slowly erased. Charles heard about her reaction within hours. The king moved toward her rooms, then stopped before reaching them. He knew what comfort might cost. If he reassured her privately, in a way that suggested the decree was temporary, every argument he had made about institutional clarity would begin to weaken. The monarch turned away instead, carrying the knowledge that firmness in public now required distance in private. William felt no satisfaction when he saw the first revised documents. The prince had defended the need for a clear boundary, yet seeing that boundary enforced gave the issue a human weight he could no longer ignore. Camilla was not simply losing a title in theory. She was watching the palace learn to describe her differently, one page at a time. The next blow came with the revised ceremonial schedule. Camilla found that a role she had expected to perform beside Charles had been removed as well. A ceremonial schedule sets out who takes part in official royal duties and in what order. Its change proved the decree was affecting more than words. Her absence was now being built into future appearances. That evening, Charles asked to see William alone. No advisors, no files, no carefully prepared language. Father and son would finally speak without the institution standing between them. For the first time since the crisis began, father and son would have to decide whether protecting the crown had cost them something they could never recover. When Charles finally sat alone with William, neither man began with Camilla's title. The silence was more personal than that. One was a king who had spent a lifetime waiting to inherit the crown. The other was the son destined to inherit everything that remained after him. Between them stood a decision neither could undo. And for once, monarchy disappeared from the conversation long enough for a father to admit what the decree had actually cost. Charles broke the silence first. He asked William whether he believed he had destroyed his marriage simply to protect an institution. The king did not sound angry. He sounded exhausted. William waited before answering because he knew the wrong words could turn honesty into accusation. The prince said he had never wanted Camilla humiliated. He had wanted one thing made impossible to misunderstand. Sovereign authority belonged to the monarch alone, and no private relationship could blur that boundary. William leaned forward as the conversation deepened. Sovereign authority meant the legal and ceremonial power attached directly to the crown, not the influence held by someone close to it. That distinction mattered, because the next reign would inherit every precedent Charles allowed to stand. The future king told his father that correcting the boundary now did not erase years of loyalty, affection, or shared history. Refusing to correct it, however, could have left a much deeper wound for whoever inherited the monarchy next. Charles finally admitted what he had resisted saying aloud. Defending Camilla had become tied to defending his own life choices. For so long, every criticism of her had felt like criticism of him, and that instinct had made it harder to recognize when legitimate institutional concerns were being raised. The monarch acknowledged that he had delayed the confrontation because accepting the problem felt dangerously close to admitting that those closest to him had been right. Then Charles revealed something William had not expected. In their recorded private conversation, he explained that the strongest language in the decree had come from him personally, not from Anne, and not from his son. The king had ordered the broader review of active palace records because he wanted responsibility to rest with the sovereign alone. If Camilla blamed someone, he wanted that blame directed at him. William softened. He told his father that dignity still mattered. Camilla could lose the title in official usage without being treated as though her entire life beside Charles had meant nothing. The two men agreed that respect would remain, but the title would not return. Their understanding finally settled the argument inside the family. Outside the palace, however, another battle was already beginning. Someone had noticed the missing title, and the change was spreading beyond private documents. What had begun behind a closed palace door was now printed in headlines large enough for the entire world to read. By sunrise, the palace no longer controlled the emotional temperature of the story. Britain woke to a royal crisis, reduced to 6 devastating words across newspaper stands. King removes Camilla's queen title. Television studios abandoned their planned schedules. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Commentators argued over marriage, monarchy, duty, and humiliation. Yet beneath the noise, one image captured the moment better than any debate. An official palace document bearing Camilla's name, and the unmistakable absence of the word queen. Camilla heard her former title repeated by strangers before she was ready to hear it at all. A national newspaper had placed the story across its front page, beside enlarged copies of an older palace record and the newly revised form of address. That comparison mattered because it showed the public exactly what had changed. Official palace language is the wording used by the royal household to define rank, duties, and formal status. And now that language had been altered deliberately rather than accidentally. Outside Buckingham Palace, the reaction divided quickly. Some in the crowd argued that Charles had protected the clarity of the crown by making sure no consort could appear to exercise authority independently. Others saw only the human cost and called the decision unnecessarily harsh. The king followed the coverage, but refused advice to soften the decree with a long explanatory statement. He believed any attempt to dilute the wording now would make the decision appear uncertain. Camilla watched part of the television discussion privately. She listened as broadcasters debated her marriage, her influence, and the meaning of the missing title, as though every private wound had suddenly become public property. The queen consort stayed silent until one commentator repeated the phrase, "former queen title," several times. She reached for the control and switched the television off. The silence afterward felt heavier than the noise had. William understood that the monarchy needed a different message. The prince appeared beside his father at a scheduled engagement, standing with him without hesitation. His presence carried meaning, because the line of succession, the order determining who inherits the throne, remained visibly united even while the family itself was under strain. The future king did not speak about Camilla, but he did not need to. His decision to stand beside Charles told the country that the institutional structure had not fractured. The public battle had reached its peak, but inside the palace, the outcome was already settled. The title was not coming back. The documents would remain changed. Charles now faced only the conversation he had delayed from the beginning, telling Camilla, without advisors or legal language between them, what the decision meant for their marriage. When the noise outside finally faded, Charles faced the one conversation no decree, advisor, or royal protocol could conduct for him. The final conversation was not about winning. There was nothing left to win. The decree had been signed, the records had been changed, and the world had already witnessed the consequences. Charles could not restore the title without undoing the very boundary he had chosen to defend. Camilla could not pretend the decision had left their relationship untouched. What remained between them was harder than confrontation, the need to accept a new reality without destroying everything that had existed before it. Charles met her privately and did not hide behind advisors or prepared language. He told Camilla directly that the decree would stand permanently. There would be no reversal and no restoration of the queen title in official palace records. The king knew the words would hurt, but uncertainty would hurt more. Official palace records were the institutional documents that fixed how rank, duties, and royal status were recognized, and changing them again would reopen every question the decree had been designed to settle. Camilla listened without interrupting. When she finally answered, she admitted that losing the word itself was not the deepest wound. What hurt was knowing Charles had personally authorized its removal. The queen consort saw the decision for what it had become, proof that the crown could demand something from him that their marriage could not overrule. She did not shout. She simply told him that some decisions remain correct and painful at the same time. Charles accepted that judgment. He told her the decree did not erase their shared life or reduce years of loyalty to nothing. The monarch had drawn a distinction between private affection and sovereign authority, because the institution could not survive if one became confused with the other. Love could shape a reign, but it could not create constitutional power where none existed. Anne stepped away from the dispute once the boundary was settled. She had wanted clarity, not revenge. William reached the same quiet conclusion. The prince understood that being heir sometimes meant supporting decisions that protected the next reign while bringing no personal satisfaction in the present. The palace adjusted quickly. Ceremonial duties were redistributed, revised terminology became standard, and authority flowed clearly through Charles and the direct line of succession. Camilla emerged with less institutional standing, but her dignity intact. The king preserved the clarity of the crown, yet the cost remained personal. He had protected the monarchy by accepting a permanent wound inside his own marriage. The decree would be remembered not simply as the day a title disappeared, but as the moment Charles proved that even the person closest to the sovereign could not stand above the boundaries of the crown. And that was the final meaning of the signature. Charles did not merely remove a word from palace records. He drew a permanent line between love and royal power, and chose to make the crown unmistakably sovereign. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.